September 12, 1939, marked another day of critical developments in the early stages of World War II. As the German forces continued their aggressive advance into Poland, tightening their grip around Warsaw, the Allied powers met to discuss their next steps in the face of Nazi aggression. The meeting in Abbeville, France, was a pivotal moment that would shape the early Allied response to the unfolding crisis. Meanwhile, the situation in Warsaw and across Poland grew increasingly desperate, with the Polish defenders mounting a valiant but ultimately untenable resistance. Globally, the war's impact continued to reverberate, prompting further diplomatic maneuvers and strategic recalibrations as nations assessed their positions in an increasingly unstable world. The German advance, tightening the noose around Warsaw. By September 12, the German Wehrmacht had nearly completed the encirclement of Warsaw, closing off the city from any potential reinforcements or resupply. The rapid and unrelenting pace of the Blitzkrieg, a strategy combining fast-moving armored units, mechanized infantry, and overwhelming air support, had shattered Polish defenses and left the country in disarray. The German forces were now focused on consolidating their positions around Warsaw and preparing for a final push to force the city's surrender. On this day, German troops continued to press inward, capturing key positions around Warsaw and further isolating the Polish capital. The Luftwaffe maintained its intensive bombing campaign, targeting both military installations and civilian infrastructure within the city. The aim was to demoralize the defenders and compel a quick surrender, thereby minimizing German casualties and conserving resources for future operations. The psychological toll of the siege was immense. The constant bombing and the encirclement created a sense of impending doom among Warsaw's residents. German propaganda continued to frame the campaign as a defensive action, emphasizing the success of the Wehrmacht and portraying the invasion as a necessary measure to secure Germany's borders. This narrative was designed to sustain domestic support for the war effort and maintain morale among the German population. The Polish resistance, defending Warsaw amidst growing desperation. In Warsaw, the situation grew increasingly dire. The Polish defenders, comprising regular army units, local militias, and a significant number of civilian volunteers, continued to prepare for a long and grueling siege. Under the leadership of General Walerian Chuma and Mayor Stefan Starzyński, the city's inhabitants showed remarkable resilience, fortifying positions and organizing makeshift defenses throughout the urban landscape. September 12 saw the Polish forces in Warsaw making every effort to shore up their defenses despite the increasingly bleak situation. Communication with other parts of Poland was nearly impossible, and the ability to coordinate a broader defense strategy was severely limited. Nonetheless, the defenders were determined to hold out for as long as possible, hoping for some form of relief or support from the Allies. The humanitarian crisis within Warsaw deepened. Hospitals were overwhelmed with casualties, and shortages of essential supplies, including food, water, and medicine, became more acute. The constant threat of air raids made it difficult to distribute aid or evacuate civilians from heavily bombed areas. Despite these challenges, the spirit of defiance remained strong among Warsaw's residents, many of whom took inspiration from Starzyński's daily radio addresses that called for courage and unity in the face of adversity. The Abbeville Conference, Allied strategy and hesitation. As the situation in Poland deteriorated, the Allied powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France, faced a critical decision point. On September 12, a key meeting took place in Abbeville, France, where British and French military and political leaders gathered to discuss their strategy and response to the German invasion of Poland. The Abbeville Conference would prove to be a defining moment in the early Allied approach to the war. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, along with his military advisors, faced a complex set of strategic dilemmas. There was considerable public pressure to support Poland more actively and to take a firmer stand against Germany. However, the logistical and military realities of launching an immediate offensive were daunting. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, was still in the process of deploying to France, and there were significant concerns about the readiness of the British Army for large-scale operations. During the Abbeville Conference, British leaders emphasized the need for caution and preparation, arguing against any hasty military action that could lead to unnecessary casualties without achieving significant strategic gains. The Royal Navy's blockade of Germany remained a cornerstone of British strategy, aimed at weakening the German war economy and disrupting supply lines. The Royal Air Force, RAF, continued to focus on defensive operations and reconnaissance, with no immediate plans for large-scale bombing raids on German territory. In France, Prime Minister Édouard Daladier and his military advisors were also grappling with the question of how best to respond to the crisis in Poland. The French army, heavily fortified along the Maginot Line, was primarily focused on defense, preparing for a potential German offensive in the west. Some French military leaders advocated for a more aggressive stance to relieve pressure on Poland and demonstrate solidarity with the beleaguered ally. However, the overall consensus at Abbeville was to avoid direct engagement with German forces at this early stage, reflecting a cautious approach driven by the desire to avoid the devastating losses of World War I. The outcome of the Abbeville Conference was a decision to delay any immediate offensive action. Both the British and French governments agreed that they were not yet prepared for a full-scale assault against Germany and would focus on building up their military strength and coordinating their efforts more effectively. This decision would have significant implications for the course of the war, as it effectively left Poland to continue fighting alone against the overwhelming might of the German military. International reactions, diplomatic maneuvers, and strategic calculations. The decisions made at the Abbeville Conference and the ongoing siege of Warsaw continued to provoke strong reactions from around the world, prompting countries to reassess their positions and strategies in light of the rapidly evolving conflict. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained his policy of neutrality, but the events in Poland were increasingly seen as a potential threat to global stability. On September 12, discussions within the U.S. government focused on the possibility of providing more substantial support to the Allies, including economic and material aid. The cash-and-carry policy, which would allow belligerents to purchase arms from the U.S. provided they transported the goods themselves, gained further support as a means of aiding Britain and France while maintaining American neutrality. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin and his advisors closely monitored the situation in Poland. The secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, and as German forces advanced deeper into Polish territory, the Soviet Union prepared to assert its interests in the eastern part of the country. The Red Army remained on high alert, ready to intervene when the time was deemed appropriate. Soviet propaganda maintained a narrative of neutrality, while preparations for potential military action were underway behind the scenes. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's regime continued to advocate for a negotiated peace, positioning Italy as a potential mediator in the conflict. On September 12, Mussolini reiterated his proposal for an international conference to resolve the war, seeking to bolster Italy's diplomatic standing while avoiding direct involvement in the conflict. However, this offer was largely dismissed by the Western Allies, who viewed it as an attempt to weaken their resolve and buy time for the Axis powers. Other neutral nations, such as Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands, continued to bolster their defenses and prepare for potential spillover from the conflict. These countries, aware of their strategic positions and vulnerabilities, sought to maintain their neutrality while preparing for potential threats from both the Axis and Allied powers. The situation was particularly tense in Belgium and the Netherlands, where fears of German invasion prompted increased military readiness and diplomatic efforts to secure guarantees of neutrality. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 12, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph reported on the Abbeville Conference and the ongoing siege of Warsaw. Coverage emphasized the importance of Allied solidarity and the need for national unity in the face of the growing threat posed by Nazi Germany. Editorials called for increased support for Poland and debated the merits of launching an offensive against Germany versus continuing a more cautious approach. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde highlighted the worsening situation in Warsaw and the decisions made at the Abbeville Conference. The French press reflected the public's growing anxiety and frustration with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. Opinion pieces called for greater coordination with the British and a more aggressive stance to support Poland, while others warned of the risks of escalating the conflict without adequate preparation. In Germany, state-controlled media continued to push the narrative of a justified war effort, emphasizing the successes of the Wehrmacht in Poland and the righteousness of Germany's actions. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff highlighted the military victories and portrayed the war as a defensive struggle against foreign aggression. The propaganda aimed to maintain public morale and support for the war effort, even as the realities of a prolonged conflict began to take shape. In the United States, newspapers such as the New York Times and the Washington Post provided extensive coverage of the events in Europe, with detailed analyses of military movements and diplomatic developments. The American press remained largely neutral but increasingly recognized the potential implications of the conflict for U.S. foreign policy and global stability. Opinion pieces explored the debate over isolationism versus engagement, reflecting the ongoing uncertainty within American society about the nation's role in the world, strategic implications, and the road ahead. The events of September 12, 1939, highlighted the rapid escalation of the conflict and the strategic dilemmas faced by all parties involved. For Poland, the day marked a critical phase in the defense of Warsaw, as the city prepared for a siege that would test its endurance and resolve. The Polish government's appeals for more substantial Allied support reflected a growing sense of desperation, as the promised assistance seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive in time to make a meaningful difference. For the United Kingdom and France, the day underscored the complexities of coalition warfare and the challenges of transitioning from peace to war. Both nations were still adjusting to the realities of a conflict that they had hoped to avoid and were grappling with the strategic uncertainties of how best to respond to German aggression. The debates over offensive versus defensive strategies, and the extent to which they could and should support Poland directly, reflected broader tensions within the Allied leadership that would continue to shape the early phases of the war. Internationally, the events of September 12 prompted further reassessments and strategic recalibrations. The United States maintained its official stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential global implications of the conflict. The Soviet Union, Italy, and other nations watched closely, each calculating how best to navigate the rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape to their advantage. Conclusion: a war deepening and global stakes rising. September 12, 1939, was a day of intensifying conflict and growing uncertainty, as the rapid German advance in Poland and the hesitant Allied response highlighted the complexities of the early days of World War II. The unfolding events revealed the challenges of coalition warfare, the limits of pre-war planning and preparation, and the unpredictable nature of a conflict that was beginning to engulf much of Europe and threaten global stability. For the nations involved, it was a time of critical decisions and strategic positioning, as they sought to navigate a war that was evolving faster than anyone had anticipated. For the people of the world, it was a time of fear, hope, and resilience, as they faced the prospect of another devastating conflict and the challenges that lay ahead. The events of September 12 set the stage for a war that would reshape the political, social, and economic landscape of the 20th century, leaving an indelible mark on history.